Someone left a comment on a Pokemon pixel art piece I made about how the second evolution, Flaffy, is their favorite, even though most people probably like Mareep or Ampharos. And that got me thinking about how underappreciated the middle evolution in your typical 3-stage evolution line is. You know, everyone loves Squirtle because he's just a cute little guy, and no one can deny how tough Blastoise is. But what about Wartortle? He's what I call a black sheep Pokemon, which is the middle stage that's often overshadowed by the other Pokemon in its evolution line. So I wanted to pay a tribute to him and maybe some other Pokemon in future videos by trying to make my own pixel art and even doing some sprite analysis of the official Pokemon art along the way. First things first, I always use a reference, and this is something I really recommend at any stage in your art journey. You're no less of an artist, and in fact you can learn a lot from references and it'll make your art better. So using the reference, I'm asking myself, what are the big shapes and forms? Sometimes I'll dive straight into the line art, but more often than not, I'll use the circle brush to kind of build up a silhouette and then carve into it once I've got a solid foundation. I find this beginning stage is often the hardest for me, so I try not to think too hard when I'm making my first few strokes. A recent trend I've been seeing on social media lately is this make it exist first, you can make it better later idea, like this one from Mirutatep, if I'm saying that correctly. And I think that that's a really great philosophy to have when you're trying to create something. Instead of getting caught up in all the initial imperfections, just get something made and then iterate over it until you're happy. That's what I did here. I just had this big blob and started going over each line, usually with multiple passes. I actually think I spent too long on the line art phase and made too many passes over it because I knew I wasn't going to keep much of what I had, especially on the eyes, hands, and feet, if you can say that Wartortle has hands and feet. But I guess that they're more like claws and webbed flippers. But in any case, you can see that all that extra time spent didn't really pay off because, like, what was I thinking with his face? He looks really freaking demonic. So when I took a step back and saw that awful expression, I just wanted to move on to the base color. So I grabbed the color picker and plopped down a few basic colors from the reference. Usually I try to challenge myself to find a close color match using the HSV sliders, but I was feeling a little bit lazy and I knew I was going to change the colors later on anyways, so I didn't want to make the same mistake I did with the line art and invest too much time here. Most of my efforts with the addition of the base colors were spent trying to perfect this 3/4 head angle. I struggle with this type of thing a lot in regular pixel art portraits too, where the cheekbone angles in towards the eye socket and then back out again for the brow ridge. I haven't been able to figure this out quite yet, and I couldn't do it here either, so I figured why not see how the actual Pokemon pixel art solved this problem and see what else I could learn along the way. The website PokemonDB.net has all the sprites from each generation, including the variations within the generations that I had no idea about. Like, I never knew that the pose in silver was different to the one in gold. So I grabbed 1 or 2 sprites from each gen all the way up to Gen 5 and got to studying. My favorite thing about early pixel art is seeing how they used the palette limitations. Both gens 1 and 2 had the same 4-color limit, and I like how the halftone is used as a bit of anti-aliasing for the curves of the line work. Particularly on the Gen 2 Wartortle, the blue tone on his shell and tail softens up the curves just a smidge, and that's something that I need to incorporate into more of my work. Gens 3 and 4 both upped the color count significantly, which allowed for a lot more realistic lighting schemes. You can see that the dithering from the Gen 2 sprite was largely replaced by these soft gradients that helped to convey curves in the form. I'm a little torn on this though because I'm kind of a sucker for good dithering, like this spot on the Gen 4 shell. I struggle with dithering, so whenever I see it done well, it always makes me happy. And maybe it's weird that I smile whenever I see a checkerboard pixel pattern, but hey, that's just who I am. Anyways, the Gen 5 sprite is probably my favorite because this is how I remember Wartortle growing up, even though I stopped playing Pokemon at around Gen 4. And this is also the perfect sprite to end on because it's the pixel art version of the reference I was using. I don't want to spend too long on how terrible I did compared to the pros, like I'm cringing really bad looking at this already, but a few things immediately pop out when I look at the sprites side by side. On the official sprite, the head and shell are more rounded, he has a more athletic stance, and look at his hand, he looks like a little diva. The biggest thing that I like about this sprite though, and really all the sprites from Gen 2 onwards, is how effectively the artists conveyed the way that the cheekbone protrudes, like I mentioned earlier. On the sprites with this 3/4 view, you can see that the cheekbone and brow ridge are in line with one another, whereas in my version, the brow extends out further than the cheek. And they also butt up the line work right next to the actual eye, whereas I have a 1 pixel space. And sometimes they even changed the line color here to convey how the form of the face was rounding around the skull. I think that's why my Wartortle looks so demonic and menacing, like his head shape is just strange and it makes him look like a cursed little baby. So I was thinking, alright, I need to make some changes, and the Gen 2 sprite was calling to me like the Green Goblin mask, so I figured why not do a complete overhaul. I don't know if my dithering bias played a role, but look at this pose of the Gen 2 sprite. Does this not look like a general commanding his troops in battle? So I had to change my design to play off of this. I mean, like, the name is literally Wartortle. How could I not make him seem like a battle commander? These major changes halfway through a piece really suck, but I found that separating it into different layers can help expedite this process. I use Sprite, but the features that I'm about to get into should be available in pretty much all digital art software. First, I start with the rectangular marquee tool in order to create a broad selection, and then using the same marquee tool, I right-click and drag to create an area that carves away the selection. This allows me to capture the exact area I want to cut. Finally, I use the New Layer via Cut hotkey, which in Sprite is Ctrl-Alt-J. And I did this a few more times, creating separate layers for the head, body, tail, and even one of the ears. It's a little bit tedious to do all this, but I think it's well worth it because of how easy it makes any kind of major redesign. However, I'm all about improving my workflow with new features and hotkeys and whatever else I can use, so if you've got a better way to do this, please let me know. Once I set up my layers and moved everything to where it needed to be, I was essentially just upscaling the Gen 2 base sprite. So I made all the aforementioned adjustments to the head and deviated from the base by making one of the fingers pointing towards some notional battlefield objective off screen. And another change that I made, and that I think really helped sell this new stance, was to flatten out the feet so that it seemed like he was actually planted on the ground instead of just magically hovering. In my initial design, I was trying to show that he had these webbed flippers with little pixel protrusions, maybe where the bone or cartilage would extend out, but you can actually convey a similar effect by instead having a flat foot with a small indent where the webbing would curve inward. Alright, I've got a solid foundation, finally, but instead of just trying to recreate art as I see it, which is a really important skill, don't get me wrong, I've also been trying to have fun playing with a lot of the colors and different color harmonies. Like I said, starting in Gen 3, the bigger color palette allowed for colored line work, so that's usually where I try to start. The Magic Wand tool with the continuous setting off will allow you to select all of one color, which in this case is the black I used for the outlines. Then you can just paint accordingly and not have to worry about the brush bleeding over onto the rest of the piece because you've set up this fenced off area, so to speak, to contain your colors. I color picked a nearby color and either increased or decreased the value depending on if the edge was in light or shadow. You can see that this effect alone makes the piece look really cool, but there were still some lighting inconsistencies on the forms that needed to be touched up, so that's the next thing I did. This was a really simple adjustment. It just involved shifting the highlights to the new correct place, given the change in stance, which therefore created a change in where the light would be hitting the form. On the skin, I kept these light and shadow areas as large color blocks, but I still wanted to pay respect to the Gen 2 sprite, so on the shell I use a little bit of dithering to convey texture, but not too much, as it would probably need to remain pretty smooth for hydrodynamic purposes. The last thing was to brainstorm a few ideas for the final color scheme. The tail and ears are light and feathery, almost like clouds, so I landed on this idea of turning them into cotton candy. And since I was really leaning into the whole war general idea, I went for a red cotton candy feel, but ended up shifting it closer to pinkish or purple. Alright, that about wraps it up. I really want to make both Charmeleon and Ivysaur to round out the Gen 1 sprites, since that's where I started my Pokemon journey. But if you have any favorite Black Sheep Pokemon, let me know, and maybe I'll make a compilation video or something. Thanks for watching.